Hi, my name is Clarissa. I'm a researcher at the University of Michigan Life Sciences Institute. And today I want to talk to you about the work that we're doing to try to figure out how we can block bacteria from making us sick. So bacteria are single-celled organisms and they are everywhere. A couple of examples just to give you an idea of how many bacteria there are around us all the time. The number of microorganisms in 1 teaspoon of soil is roughly equivalent to the number of humans that are living in Africa. Couple of other examples for you. There are about 100 million times as many bacteria in the oceans as there are stars in the known universe. And then last one is a little gross. Dental plaque is so densely packed with bacteria that just 1 gram, that's about the weight of a paperclip, contains as many bacteria as humans have ever lived. So they're everywhere, and that's frankly neither good or bad. There are some good bacteria. So for example, we need certain bacteria in our digestive tract, and that's why Jamie Lee Curtis is using that fact to sell us some yogurt. But there can also be bad bacteria. These pictures are about to be a little bit gross. So for example, strep throat, staph infections, scarlet fever, some types of food poisoning can all be caused by bacteria. So the problem is when bad bacteria get into our body or when the balance of good and bad gets thrown off. And I want to tell you about a specific bacterial disease, Legionnaires disease, and we first learned about this in 1976. So this was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the American Legion is a veterans organization. They held a big convention to commemorate this event, and about 180 people got sick, and about 25 of them died from this disease that was a potentially fatal type of pneumonia. And at the time, you can see from these headlines, people didn't know what was causing it, right? Time is saying they're tracing the Philly killer, and Newsweek has the mystery of the killer fever. Well, they figured out that it's a bacteria called Legionella. And Legionella were known to live in wetlands and marshes, but it turns out if they get into, for example, the heating and air conditioning system of a convention hall, then when we inhale them into our lungs, they can cause this infection that led to this potentially fatal type of pneumonia. So in our story, this Legionella, this bacteria, is definitely the villain. And we want to figure out how it's establishing an infection. So we know that it has some type of a secret weapon, and we know what the parts are. So I want you to imagine if we had this parts list that I'm showing you now. Do we know what weapon this makes? I wouldn't. So it's kind of helpful, but we still don't know what the weapon is or how the parts are put together, and we certainly don't know how to disarm it. Even if we have some idea of what certain parts look like, we still don't know how they fit together and how this machinery, how this weapon works. What we need to be able to do is understand the whole picture, and we're using a microscope for that. Now, when you think of a microscope, you probably think of something like I'm showing you here, right? This is from CSI. So if you've seen forensic shows, or maybe you saw a user microscope in a biology class, this is a light microscope. It uses a beam of light. It uses lenses made of glass, and you're able to magnify the image that you're looking at. And it works great for a lot of things, but some things, like a tiny complex that's inside bacterial cells, are too small to ever be seen with a light microscope. So we use an electron microscope. This is me with our electron microscope. You can see it's huge. I'm about 5'8". So this microscope, instead of using a beam of light, it uses a beam of electrons. And instead of using glass lenses, it uses electromagnetic lenses. And we're able to get great pictures, basically, of these really small complexes, like the one we want to study here, the secret weapon that Legionella is using. So in this story, if Legionella is the villain, then this microscope is the superhero. So I want to go back to this parts list. We have a parts list. We know what a couple of the pieces look like, but then how do we put them together? Once we have the complete picture and we see how the parts put together and we see the entire assembled machine, we can tell, okay, this is a crossbow. Now we can figure out how we can disarm it. How can we break it? We know how to think about how it works. So we want to do the same thing and reveal the secret weapon that Legionella are using. And so using our superhero microscope, I was able to do just that. This is an image of the picture of the secretion system, or the secret weapon that Legionella used to infect cells. This is kind of just a view of the outside. We're looking at what I think of as the side. If we kind of cut through the middle, now you can see how it's oriented. between the two membranes that enclose this bacterial cell. And this is why I really like the crossbow analogy. So if we think about how a crossbow works, we're able to store energy in those cables that are pulled tight, and that energy is then used to propel the arrow through the crossbow and ultimately to the target. And that's pretty similar to how the Legionella weapon or secretion system works. It uses energy. Now, in this case, the energy is from breaking chemical bonds and a chemical called ATP. And the arrows can be any number of things. This system is thought to use about 300 different types of arrows that are all molecules that the bacteria produces that need to get into our lung cells in order to establish an infection. So this weapon uses that energy from ATP to shoot some of these 300 different molecules through this complex, through this weapon, and to the target, which in this case is the host cell or our lung immune cells. So what I'm showing you here is a really blown up view of one part of this weaponry. There are actually 13 copies of this that form a ring around that central cavity that you saw in the last slide. And this is a type of image that's called a ribbon diagram. It's something that structural biologists like me use to demonstrate or kind of show some some very common types of shapes that proteins take. But what's most important for you to take away from this is that each of these colors represents a different piece, a different part that's used to make up this protein. And you can see that they're all really woven together, right? This is a really complicated structure. There's no way we would have guessed from just a parts list how this was put together. And again, this is one copy out of 13 that make up this part of this Legionella weaponry. Another thing that's pretty exciting, each of these colors I mentioned represents a different part. Two of these parts, the one shown in blue and kind of teal, were not expected to be part of this complex or of this system. So it was really surprising to find them here, and you can see that we're already making some discoveries that are going to help us understand how this machinery works and how we can then dismantle or disarm it. That said, while the colored regions are the proteins or the pieces that we were able to identify, the parts you see here that are gray are pieces that we haven't identified yet. So we definitely still have more work to do. But it's also exciting when we step back because Legionella is only one bacteria that uses this type of weaponry. There are also others. So for example, Helicobacter pylori can cause stomach cancer. Bordetella pertussis causes whooping cough. And both of these use a similar type of machinery or a similar type of weapon in order to establish those infections. So as we continue to understand how these tools are put together and how they're similar or different between different bacteria, then we can start to come up with a common strategy or potentially design a universal defense against bacteria that use this type of weaponry. In that case, we can effectively break down their machinery, and that's why now our villainous bad guys have these huge frowns on their faces as they're no longer able to infect their human hosts.